Hello and welcome. I'm Barkha Dutt, and you're watching the Mojo Story, our independent digital platform that does a deep dive into the big stories of the day. In India, Twitter is quite literally in the middle of a tense who will blink first battle with the government. The government has been asking the social networking platform to block and take down a designated number of accounts. But Twitter has pushed back, saying that it will not be restricting freedom of speech. In the meantime, high profile government functionaries, as well as those who are considered close to the ruling party, are wanting to work to move and exit out of Twitter to an alternative platform called Coup, leading to any number of puns and jokes. But the larger question remains, is Twitter really standing up for free speech, or is it being somewhat disingenuous? And why is the government locked in this battle with Twitter? Is this about free speech, or is it about something else? Let's introduce our panel on the program today. We are joined by R. Jagannathan, a veteran journalist and editor. We're also joined by Pranav Dixit, who is, of course, with BuzzFeed and spends a lot of time covering issues of technology. We're joined by author and journalist Salil Tripathi, who did find himself locked out of Twitter one day arbitrarily, and then his account was restored. And of course, we have Pranesh Prakash, who's a tech policy researcher. Welcome all of you to the program. Let me start by asking you, Jaggi, if I may, what do you make of this? Why is the government suddenly locked itself in this battle with Twitter? And the fact is that, any number of weird things continue to have on Twitter. For example, we have seen today a kind of conspiracy theory peddled by one Twitter handle, which even names me among other journalists, talking about how we allegedly received money to cover the farmers' protests in the way that we had. That video then goes on to say that not just be defamatory, but actually issue violent threats. And that video is still there on Twitter. So I'm just giving you an example that no matter whether you're on the right or the left of the spectrum, everybody has a complaint about some experience that they've had on Twitter, right?
Yeah.
This is uniform. Twitter seems an equal opportunity offender. Why has the government suddenly locked itself in this battle with Twitter? What do you make of it?
No, I think there are three questions here. One, is Twitter supposed to be a neutral platform, or is it a publication with its own ideology? That's one. That issue still needs to be resolved, whether it's in the US or here. The second issue is Twitter above Indian law or not? The point is, India does not have the absolute approach to freedom of speech that some other countries have, whether it's France or the US, even the US. But if we have Article 19.2, which restricts the total amount of freedom you have subject to certain limitation, there are 7 or 8 restrictions maintained there, then is Twitter really not supposed to follow those restrictions? And in a thing, then there is the Information Technology Act, there is the 69 Article Clause 69, which says that the government, how it will regulate platforms. So I think if Twitter think that it's above all of this, then I think it's not right. Yes, whether government has needlessly taken a war to Twitter, or whether Twitter has chosen to take the war to the government, I do not know. But I do think that Twitter cannot be above Indian law. If Indian law applies to all Indians, surely Twitter needs to apply that law. After all, for example, we have simple things like saying you can't show a wrong Indian map. Okay, that's part of the law. Now, maybe in the US, you can do all kinds of things and nobody is going to take you to jail for that. In India, you can go to jail for that. So if you can either say that law has to be changed, Article 19.2 needs to be abolished, or whatever it is, you fight that fight, then it's fine. But as long as you say those restrictions remain, then you can't say I will not subject myself to those laws. That's the basic things I would like to say.
So according to you, Twitter is being ideologically biased, or it's being disruptive in terms of defying Indian law? Which one are you alleging, Jaggi?
Both things. I think this is not an allegation made only in India. Even in the US, I think conservatives believe that Twitter is biased against them and it gives left liberal views freer reign. And the fact that Twitter can just deplatform a sitting US president, come on, it sucks. Even Macron has said you can't do this, right? So I think let's not pretend that Twitter is somehow some neutral platform. It is not.
Okay, so let me then bring in someone whom you would call left liberal, who found himself suddenly deplatformed from Twitter, Salil Tripathi. So that's what I'm trying to say, that whether you're on the right or the left of the spectrum, I know you may not identify as left in the same way that I don't, and I'm often labeled that. So these are easy labels also that we all use for each other. But Salil, more seriously, I mean, for the right wing, you would be seen as left, and we all defy these easy labels. But you did find yourself, your account frozen, your account locked. You had no idea what happened. A lot of people made noise and then you were back. What do you make of Jaggi's sort of argument that one, Twitter can't be above Indian law, and two, it is ideologically leans left rather than right?
Okay, so yeah, I'm unmuted. Yeah, so yeah, left sees me as right and right sees me as left. So I'm somewhere where I don't know where I am, but that's where I am. I just thought I'll clarify that. But on the more substantive point, I do think that the issues that Jaggi is raising are very crucial and important, because Twitter cannot have it both ways. It cannot say that it's a neutral platform while at the same time maintaining a control over who says what on its platform. I mean, you can say that it has a right to, like, Barkha, you own this space. And if I behave badly, you can kick me out. And it'll be your right to do that if I start speaking nonsense. So I think Twitter can retain that right. But if it does that, then it has to accept the fact that it is playing this role of some kind of editorial control, if not censorship. Now, the Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act in America does allow Twitter and Facebook, to the opportunity to abdicate responsibility. Now, that's an American law. Others may not agree. Scandinavia may agree. France may not agree. Other countries in Europe may not agree because of their laws on Nazi propaganda, for example. So this idea about, one global standard is an elusive one. That said, I think Twitter is within its right to argue its case with India in India, because it cannot simply say that because this is domestic law, we will comply by it. Because in China, China, you can't even get Twitter properly. So that's a different issue. You need a VPN and all that. But in China, if you are there, and if you were to put straightforward information on Xinjiang, or straightforward information about, let's say, what's happening to Uyghurs, of course, in Xinjiang, or about Hong Kong, or for that matter, about the virus and, what happened in Wuhan, you could be, the government can say, take it down. But all that information could be extremely necessary for democracy, for human rights, and all of that. So I think Twitter is right in saying that, no, we need clarity. We'll go under the law and we will uphold standards. And companies always have this issue about whether they should comply with a local standard or a global one. Sometimes the global standard is superior, which they should. Sometimes the local standard makes a lot of sense, and they should, and it is always subjective.
But here is the problem, and let me get Pranesh in this. On the one hand, you have platforms accused of hate mongering, spreading fake news, not doing enough to make interventions, to actually leading to skewed political outcomes because there is no sort of content checking. And then on the other hand, you have this kind of absolutist free speech thought that says no one should be taken down. Should anyone be taken down? And if the laws of the land are to apply, what if those laws are considered arbitrary, as Salil said, by a company that maybe in this case comes from more an American perspective than an Indian perspective on free speech?
Actually, even Indians would agree with that view. Actually, Indians would agree with that view too, that, some of the steps that the government is taking are wrong here. So it's not an American view imposed on India. It's a view that's articulating the Indian view too.
I think the problem is that the conversation is so polarized, right? That there is no consensus on what is the right view. That's the first point.
Correct.
And the second point is that I find, frankly, this pushback by Twitter quite curious. It seems to have come more after the Biden win in the United States of America. It doesn't seem to have existed before. It seems almost maybe driven politically by its own domestic politics to sort of stand up for the more sort of progressive idea. And even now, there continues to be hate speech, violent speech, misogynistic speech, rape threats, death threats, defamation, and it continues to function. And one of the problems, Pranesh, about Twitter is that if enough people push a hashtag, that hashtag can just acquire a life of its own, right? And that hashtag can defame somebody, that hashtag can threaten somebody, that hashtag can do all sorts of things. That is the nature of the algorithm. So from a tech point of view, how does this work, Pranesh?
So I'm also a lawyer, so I'll speak from a legal point of view. I personally am not a free speech absolutist. I believe that Twitter should abide by Indian laws, but so should the government. Is Twitter biased? I believe absolutely yes. For instance, I believe it is hypocritical for Twitter to have taken down New York Post and its account on its own without any kind of clear violation of anything, and then to reinstate the Caravan, which they did when the government asked for it to be blocked. However, hypocrisy is separate from, doesn't actually make the government right. And I, as an Indian citizen, don't have as much control over what Twitter does. I did not vote for, the policy managers at Twitter. I, on the other hand, did vote in the Indian elections, and the government of India, what it does have a bearing. Now, did the government of India abide by Section 69A? That is my question. So when accounts like Caravan India, when accounts like the Member of Parliament Sukhdev Yadav, right? When these accounts are being sought to be blocked, were they given an opportunity as required under the law to represent themselves? As far as I know, they were not. And it came as a surprise to them that they were blocked in the first place, right? So did the government actually procedurally follow the law? Secondly, whether on substance, whether what the government's complaining about, okay, a lot of different issues have cropped up. They've said hate speech, they've said things like fake news and so on. But to me, a lot of it seems to be about one particular hashtag saying that the Prime Minister is planning genocide. Now, is that hyperbolic? Absolutely, yes. Is it nonsensical? I believe so. But is it something that falls under Section 69A? Now, as an Indian citizen, I have the right to question whether the government has rightfully construed it as falling under 69A or not. And I don't believe it actually does fall under 69A.
But Pranesh, the government would argue that it's the kind of hashtag that could lead to violence, that could lead to an inflammable situation on the streets. That's what the government
so there's a
Equally,
there are other
hashtags that are pushed by political parties, by their bases every single day, that are extremely violent, extremely threatening against individuals, and the government doesn't step in. At that point, the government has stepped in to protect either itself or a law and order situation. But what happens to individuals who are defamed? What happens to individuals who are threatened?
Defamation, for instance, is not a ground under 69A under which the government can ban speech. Okay, defamation is not part of it. Okay, they can say that it is possibly incitement to violence. But again, for the bar for that, as per Supreme Court rulings in India, is quite high. You have to show that there was incitement, you have to show that it was imminent, and to lawless action. Okay, so there is, and if the government has a case, let it make it public. Okay, but secret orders which are not being published by the government for censorship, okay, and asking us to trust it at its word rather than showing us evidence that it actually did, is making the right decisions, harks back to what happened in 2012 under the UPA regime. Okay, when again very similar orders were passed under 69A. Okay, I got a leaked copy of the order and I analyzed the order and said, and I pointed out many egregious cases of things that clearly should not have been banned. Okay, and right now that doesn't. So it's not about one particular government at the end of the day. It's about whether Indian government is abiding by the law that Parliament has laid down. And I also want to make one additional point here. The Constitution of India, under Article 19(2), permits the government to put down restrictions, but it places limitations on what the government can do and what Parliament can do. Okay, those restrictions have to be reasonable. They are that can be adjudicated by the courts under its powers of judicial review. But those restrictions don't apply directly to companies like Twitter or Facebook, or indeed to any Indian company, right? Those restrictions are restrictions placed on the Indian government, on the Indian Parliament. Those aren't things that must be removed. So Article 19(2) doesn't say you have to remove this kind of speech. It says if Parliament decides in its wisdom, then it may pass a law on these grounds. And those laws have to be reasonable and that can be
For you,
adjudicated,
for
and
you,
it
this
makes
is
us.
for you. What's happening between the government and Twitter is reminiscent of the 69A controversy that took place on the UPA watch. Jaggi, I just want a quick intervention on that before I come to Pranav. Why do you think the government is suddenly locked in this battle with Twitter? What do we make of this alternative Swadeshi platform called Coup? I mean, I joked today saying that this was, the government's version of a coup d'etat. But jokes aside, it lends itself to all kinds of puns, which is fun. What is the story behind it? Why does the government feel the need for an alternative platform, and can it really go off Twitter?
Well, two questions. One is, I think I agree with a lot of the earlier speakers that we need much clearer definitions of what ought to be free speech and what ought to be banned, and that's not very clear. It's not clear even in Article 92, because the whole raft of things can be construed to be, valid restrictions. So the same problem with 69A and other things, which is very generic in terms of what it bans. So I think that definitions need to be far clearer on what today. For example, a simple thing like injuring relationship with a friendly country. If tomorrow we say Indo, Indi, Chini, bye bye, and somebody writes that China TikTok should be banned, and I can be put behind bars saying that, oh, you're endangering a good relationship with China. So I mean, it's as vague as that. So we need clarity on that. That's it. As far as coup is concerned, I think I always believe that the more the merrier. Twitter should not be the default and the monopoly platform for social media micro blogging. So there is no harm in that. There are other platforms. There is Parler, there is Coup. There is no harm in that. If government is trying to send a political message by backing Coup, yeah, okay, it's free, up to them. But I mean, I'm on both platforms. I don't think Coup is yet stable enough. But certainly there's no harm in that. What I would hate to see...
Somebody just commented saying, what's wrong with Coup? It's just a Pepsi to a Coke.
Yeah. What I would hate to see is to see different ecosystems moving to separate platforms, because what we need is a dialogue between people who disagree and not people living separately in separate echo chambers. That would be terrible.
Yeah, that's a really important point. And Pranav, what do you make of what's happening? There was this sort of Facebook government sort of meltdown that happened. You have the Facebook head actually in court against, a summons by the Delhi Assembly asking it to appear before it. And now you have this Twitter versus government. What's the story behind it? Is it just that one hashtag, which used the word genocide? In my view, not just carelessly, but actually dangerously. But then that was not the only hashtag on Twitter that is problematic. And I think what you're really seeing is the reductionist power of the algorithm. The problem with all of these platforms is that anyone pushing enough numbers on something can make anything go viral. And that is, in fact, the real sort of banality of evil that we're looking at.
No, absolutely. And I want to just agree with everything that Pranesh said before. I think he said it really articulately. There's a lot of mixed messages that I think, if you read the notice that the government sent Twitter, essentially, wrapping its knuckles, there's lots of things in there. The government says that we had asked you to take down accounts and tweets because, we wanted to preserve public order. It has some stuff in there about how freedom of the press is not absolute, which I assume they were referring to, the caravan handle. There's a lot of, Section 69A is a controversial section of the IT Act. It doesn't allow for transparency. It's very difficult for anybody to really tell whether these orders are actually legal. Section 69A also means that Twitter can't upload the actual orders that it receives to Lumen, which is like a Harvard University database that Twitter sort of uploads all the takedown orders that it receives to. In this case, it can't do that because that would be a violation of 69A. So I think the number one thing that we need here from the government, especially, I think, is a lot of transparency. I would love for the government to reveal the actual 69A order that it sent Twitter, for instance.
Salil, what bothers you about the government response at this point, and what bothers you about Twitter's response? Because in both cases, I think there's a level of opacity. I think Twitter has been as opaque as the government. You actually don't know what Twitter's thinking. It's issued this very sort of worthy statement about how it's standing up for journalists. The point is that, all of us at some point have been at the receiving end of what happens at Twitter. Twitter has been less than fair to all of us as journalists.
Oh yeah, I mean, and I don't want to belabor the point, but we did a show about my own brief suspension. I had extremely limited information about why the decision was taken, and everything was incredibly opaque. So I'm not here to defend Twitter's policies here, but Twitter has a right to frame its policies, and that Twitter has a right to take decisions based on them, and that Twitter has a right also to claim that we believe in free speech, because free speech also varies from the way Pranesh defines it, way Jaggi might define it, way Pranav you might define it, I might. Just the five of us were largely in the same space, free speech, journalism, human rights and all that, and yet we will all have slightly different perspectives. So, I mean, Twitter has a right to do. So that's one thing. What I'm genuinely curious about is that why would the government want to create a separate? I mean, I agree with Jaggi on one point that more the merrier. The competition is always better. The risk is the Weibo equivalent, where you create something of your own and prevent the other from rising by creating various ways. I mean, China is much more blunderbuss about it and has ruled out Twitter, as it were. But if that were to happen, then exactly the danger that Jaggi is talking about will happen, which is narrow casting and talking within echo chambers. And I would think that a political party would want, the John Stuart Mill type utilitarian greatest good of greatest number and reach out to as many people rather than fewer people. So an echo chamber is fine if that's what they want. It doesn't really help them in any way. And it also may sound like an Atmanirbhar thing, that this is our own app and all that. And which is also fine if it makes people feel proud about it. But you can't do this by, getting away. It's not Coke and Pepsi. It would be a bit like Coke saying Pepsi cannot exist anymore. That would be the danger. Yeah.
That's an interesting way of putting it. Pradesh, how do you actually see this playing out, right? Where is this headed? Because the point is that so far the exodus to the alternative coup platform has been mostly of people who are seen to be either government functionaries or supporters of the government. And I think Jaggi is correct in saying that we can't now have not just echo chambers, but ghetto chambers they're almost like ghettos. So worse than echo chambers. And is that what you see happening? And B, do you really think that Twitter will be able to stand up to government? Because unlike, let's say, Facebook, which had policies that it needed from government, let's say WhatsApp payments and so on, Twitter doesn't have the same dependency on government to operate in India. We have to understand that Twitter's not in it. Twitter's not looking for the sort of things that Facebook would be looking for. It's not looking for policy intervention. So Twitter could afford to be somewhat more rebellious here.
True. One thing I'll point out is a couple of years ago, Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, he said that he imagines a future where Twitter is only one part of a larger ecosystem of microblogging, platforms that can talk to each other, that are interoperable. And if that happens, I think that's great. And if Coup is also part of that kind of an ecosystem where you can all talk to each other across networks. Certain networks are better for certain kinds of things. I think that's great. I have no problem with that at all. It's just that one can't end up with a kind of ghettoization. And so how you actually so one has to pay real close attention to both the politics of different networks as well as the technology of these networks to see whether they allow for interoperability or not for communication between different networks. So that would actually reduce the power of a company like Twitter. And I think that would be a good thing. I believe the more competition it is, the more decentralized these networks are, these platforms are, the better for users. And it also means that these companies stop painting as large a target on themselves. Sure. And so it's in that perverse way, not being powerful is good for Twitter as well.
That's interesting that there's a kind of system, an almost, even if it's not organic checks and balance, even if it's an interventionist check and balance, maybe it's all healthy. I have a couple of minutes left, so let's take final comments. Pranav, you follow this space really, really closely. Do you see a shift in Twitter's approach? What do you make of the fact that Twitter, after years of actually not standing up again, with having both the right and the left complain of ideological bias, now has taken the kind of position it has?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think this is especially for in a country like India. I think I don't think we've ever had American big tech uh, ever publicly defying a ruling government in this way. So I think what Twitter's done here is significant, and I think the reason that we find ourselves here and this is blowing up is I think in this one case, Twitter actually decided to go ahead and call the government's bluff almost, and really openly challenge them. It's like saying, what are you going to do? And I think both parties are sort of, nobody knows where this is going to go, and I don't think the government really knows how to proceed from here. To be honest, that's just my personal opinion, because I don't think it can afford to ban Twitter. It needs the platform in the country.
That's an interesting point politically, Jaggi. Where do you think the government, can the government actually take this to its logical conclusion? Will we see an actual mass exodus of, let's say, the cabinet from Twitter? Like, could it go that far? I somehow don't see that happening. I mean, you can create a coup and you can create some other platform, but there is a global dimension to Twitter. And, even when the Prime Minister, for example, tags Justin Trudeau today, as he did in the vaccine story, or you have the Dominican Republic sort of head tweeting about the vaccine receiving the vaccines from India. This is a global space. India can't afford to be out of it. So Pranav, to that extent, makes an interesting point.
See, there are two things. One is people might be on both platforms. Okay, so if I feel that Twitter is discriminating against my kind of views, I have every right to be on coup. In fact, I do find Twitter has actually made shadow ban me repeatedly. And for 2 years, it has not allowed me to have a single extra follower. Now,
by the way, I have complained to Twitter 10 times that my followers have not increased in the last 2 years.
That's
and nobody would call
correct.
you and me ideologically similar.
That's
even
right,
though
correct.
it might be. But people
No,
would not see us
agreed.
that. So
Agreed.
both,
So,
yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
So fine. So if I feel that I need to do that, I need to speak my mind on my issues, and I feel another platform gives me a better opportunity, it does not block me, and I think I will use that as well. I won't quit Twitter, but I will not allow Twitter to be my only platform.
Yeah. So Salil, is it a storm in a Twitter cup? Is it all going to, maybe it will create one other platform, and that's about the worst that will happen. Legally, maybe the courts will have to take a final decision on these handles if Twitter sticks to its guns. So maybe this isn't really going to go very far for either of the protagonists.
It's possible, but unmounting a tiger is always hard, as we all know. And I think that's the problem here, that the extent to which the government sees it a prestige issue. Because I mean, Twitter also has no choice but to stand firm, because all these social media companies have faced a lot of backlash for acquiescing with requests from other governments to take down things, whether it's Myanmar, whether it's China, whether it's Turkey and India. So they want to hold back. India is the largest demander of content to be taken down worldwide by far, by miles. So standing up to India actually is something that Twitter would want to demonstrate that, yes, even if it's a large country, we will. So that's okay. But what's very important is the point you raise, and you quite rightly, you don't want to become the story, Barkha, but the threats that you and Raghu and others have received today, both in that YouTube video which has now been taken down, are atrocious. And this is where Twitter's mechanism should work, when there is a call for violence, even if it's from some random person, but if it trends, it has to figure out a way to get those trends to stop.
And by the way, all platforms have this deficiency, because that video which was taken down by YouTube is now up on other YouTube accounts, right?
Correct.
So you're also dealing with the nature of tech here.
The virality.
The virality, that's the point.
Yep.
You're dealing with that, and therefore, to that extent, would I want the laws of the land to apply? Very much. And then we're back to that argument of the laws of the land. And then when Twitter says we're going to defy the laws of the land, then we have a problem here, right?
So that's where the challenge is, that whether the defiance that Twitter is showing is consistent with international norms of human rights or not. If it's upholding those, then I'm sympathetic to it. If it's acquiescing or kowtowing, I'm not.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And Pranesh, on a day when, literally, I'm not mentioning too much about this because I'm not here as the story, but I did tweet saying this is a test for platforms. If you're really talking about cleansing your platforms, take this rubbish down, because it's not just the usual hashtag. There are actual threats in it. There's actual criminal defamation in it, right? To say that people took money to do reportage, I don't know about others, but I know for myself. And I find this sort of big expose hashtag trending, right? Now, anything can trend on any platform. That's the nature of tech. That's the nature of the algo. What should governments do? What should individuals do? Last word to you, then got to close.
For me, platforms do definitely have a responsibility to not enable violence, to counteract any kinds of threats, harassment, and they are not bound by the kinds of laws and limitations that the Indian government is. So they can apply a lower standard for freedom of speech as well when it comes to things like threats than the government of India. So ideally, you should not even need to go by a law because the harassment standard that Twitter has in its terms of service is actually weaker than the law in India. Having said that, for me, it is inevitable right now that given the kind of standoff, this is going to court. For me, the interesting question is, who is seen as an aggrieved party? Right? When Twitter is asking for a newspaper or a magazine and an MP and their accounts to be suspended, then is the aggrieved party Twitter, or is the aggrieved party whose speech is being curtailed on a particular platform? If they're the aggrieved party, why are they not being told by the government that that here's our evidence against you, come and defend yourself, and otherwise go to court? Okay, so for me, it's kind of funny. I believe this will end up in court, but who is the right party to be taking this to court? Shouldn't it be those whose voices are being curtailed?
Yeah, I think it comes back, I'll just have a last closing comment there, that it comes back to opacity. And according to me, neither the government nor Twitter have been transparent about what's actually driving these decisions. And, we need to know from both sides, for example, if the government has specific sort of information that this could have been inflammable, lead to a violent situation, the government needs to say that in public. Twitter needs to explain the sudden new norms, because we've never heard them in all these years actually standing up for these norms. So there's a complete opacity. But Aldous Huxley called it the Brave New World in a very different context. But this is the Brave New World that we're all trying to navigate. We'll have to leave it there. We'll keep a close eye on these developing stories. Salil, Jaggi, Pranav, and Pranesh, pleasure having you on the Mojo Story. Thank you so much. And to our audience, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you shortly with another new deep dive into the